The face you see in the mirror is not who you are. It is a costume, a temporary arrangement of cells you did not design, wearing a name you did not choose, in a body that will not last the century. And somewhere, quietly, underneath all of it, something older than the face has been watching the face, and wondering why none of this ever quite felt like home. You may have felt it in small moments, standing in a crowded room and suddenly forgetting why you came, looking at your own hands and feeling, for half a second, that they belong to someone else. A strange quiet that arrives just before sleep, when the day falls away and a soft, nameless question rises in its place. Who is actually here? Who is the one noticing? Welcome. Settle in. Let the light grow dim around you, and if these gentle late-night explorations bring you comfort, you might consider staying a while with this channel. There is no rush tonight. What follows is not a lecture and not a theory to defend. It is a slow, quiet investigation into a feeling almost everyone carries but rarely speaks aloud. The feeling that something about being human does not quite add up, that the body is borrowed, the world is borrowed, and the visitor inside has been here only briefly, on some errand it cannot fully remember. We will move gently tonight, the way thoughts move just before sleep, drifting from the small to the vast, the familiar to the strange, until the stranger in the mirror begins to feel less like a stranger and more like a clue. Consider for a moment the hand resting near you, the one you have known your whole life, the one that learned to hold a spoon, to write your name, to wave goodbye to people you may never see again. You think of it as yours, but almost every cell in that hand is younger than you are. Some are only days old, some are weeks. The skin you wore last winter is already gone, drifted into dust, replaced by a quieter version of itself. Biologists have noticed something gentle and strange about the human body. Most of its tissues are continually being rebuilt. The lining of the stomach renews itself in days, the surface of the skin in weeks, the bones slowly over years. By the time a decade passes, an enormous portion of the matter you call yourself has been swapped out, atom by atom, without your permission and without your awareness. And yet through all of that quiet replacement, something stays, something remembers being 6 years old, something still recognizes the voice of a parent, the smell of an old room, the ache of a name you have not said aloud in years, which raises a soft, persistent question. If the body is constantly being exchanged for new material, what exactly is the thing that has stayed? The body is not who you are. It is what you are wearing, and the material itself, when you look closely, belongs to no one in particular. The calcium in your bones once sat inside the body of a dying star, drifted across the dark for millions of years, settled into the earth, climbed up through roots and leaves, passed through the milk of an animal, and eventually arrived in the small bowl of cereal you ate as a child. The iron coloring your blood was forged in violence so old that the universe itself was younger when it happened. The water in your eyes has been rain and ocean and river and the breath of forests long since vanished. Everything you call your body is on loan from somewhere older and larger than you, so perhaps the costume of cells is more honest than it seems. It was assembled, it is being maintained, and one day it will be returned, gently to the soil and the sky and the slow currents of matter that lent it out. None of this is alarming. It is in fact very ordinary, but it points to something easy to overlook. The thing inside the costume is not the costume. The wearer is not the cloth. Some have wondered if this is the first quiet hint that we are not quite from here. After all, when you put on a coat to step outside, you do not believe you have become the coat. You know the coat is for the weather, for the journey, for the time spent in a place that is not your true room. And when the visit ends, the coat is hung on a hook by the door, and the one who wore it walks back inside, lighter, unchanged, recognizably themselves. Tonight, perhaps for the first time in a long time, you are allowed to consider that possibility softly, that the body is the coat, the world is the weather, and the one wearing all of it has been here only for a short and curious visit. There is a particular feeling almost everyone knows, even if no one ever taught them a name for it. It arrives most often in the quietest hours, after a meal that was supposed to satisfy, after a small success that was supposed to feel larger, after scrolling through 1,000 bright images that promised something and delivered almost nothing. A faint hollowness opens, somewhere just beneath the ribs, and whispers, "Is this really it?" For an animal, this should not happen. Every other creature on this planet operates on a simple principle. Hunger arrives, hunger is met, hunger goes quiet. A wolf with a full stomach does not lie under the moon and wonder if there is something more to wolf existence. A bird that has built its nest does not stare at the horizon, restless and unfulfilled. The needs of the body are designed, in every other species, to be answerable by the world they live in. The map matches the territory, the lock matches the key, but something different happens in us, something inconvenient, almost embarrassing if you sit with it long enough. The body is fed, the shelter is built, the safety is secured, the affection is given, the achievements are stacked, and still a quiet voice underneath all of it keeps asking for something that nothing in the visible world quite provides. We chase the next promotion, the next relationship, the next city, the next version of ourselves, and somewhere around the third or fourth arrival, we begin to suspect with a small ache that the destination keeps moving. Psychologists have noticed this and given it various names. The hedonic treadmill is one. The idea that pleasure resets, that whatever we acquire becomes the new baseline, that the joy of getting fades faster than we expect. Surveys across many cultures have found that beyond a certain modest threshold, more wealth, more comfort, more stimulation produces surprisingly little additional contentment. The line flattens, the hunger does not. This is curious, because in evolutionary terms, an appetite that cannot be satisfied by anything in its environment is almost a contradiction. Appetites are supposed to be tools, sharpened by the world to fit the world. A craving with no matching food is, in a sense, a craving that points outside the menu, and so gently. Some have wondered whether this particular hunger, the one no meal closes, the one no success silences, might be telling us something quiet and important. It might be the shape of a need that was calibrated for a different environment. A homesickness disguised as ambition, a thirst designed for water that does not flow in this particular river. You may have noticed this in your own life. The moment after the celebration, the strange flatness on the other side of a long-awaited day, the way joy, no matter how bright, seems to evaporate just slightly faster than you expected, leaving behind a small, polite reminder that this was not, in fact, the thing. Imagine an animal raised in a desert, dreaming of water it has never seen, refusing every glass of sand the desert offers. You would not say the animal is broken, you would say it does not belong to the desert. Perhaps the hunger inside you is not a flaw. Perhaps it is a memory. There is a kind of sadness that has no source. It arrives unannounced, often on ordinary afternoons. A particular slant of late light through a window, a song you have never heard before that somehow feels remembered. The smell of rain on warm stone in a city you have never visited, and for a moment something inside you aches for a place you cannot name, with a tenderness so specific it almost feels like grief. Every language has tried to point at this feeling. The Portuguese call it saudade, the Welsh call it hirith, the Germans have sehnsucht, the Japanese reach for natsukashi. These are not synonyms for sadness, or nostalgia, or loneliness. They are each, in their own way, attempts to describe a longing for something the person longing has never actually possessed. A homesickness with no return address. If you have lived even 30 years, you have probably felt it at least once, standing at a train window, watching steam rise from a cup, catching your own reflection in a darkened pane and feeling briefly that the person looking back is far from home, though you are sitting in your own living room. Attachment researchers have studied how children form a sense of safe place, how the brain builds an internal map of belonging. The strange thing is, even adults raised in stable, loving homes report this same wandering ache. People who have traveled nowhere feel it. People with deep family ties feel it. It is not explained by what was lost in this life, because for many people, Nothing comparable to what they long for was ever there to begin with. In other species, homing instincts are well documented. Salmon return across thousands of miles of open ocean to the precise stream of their birth. Monarch butterflies, who have never seen the forests of central Mexico, arrive there each year, several generations removed from the last butterfly that knew the way. Sea turtles navigate by faint magnetic signatures pressed into their memory before they hatched. Something is encoded in them that points home, even when home is unimaginably far. And so, gently, the question arises, what if a softer version of that compass also exists in us? What if part of the human map was drawn before this life began, pointing toward a place that is not anywhere on this particular planet? Not a country we forgot, not a childhood town, something further back, something quieter, a homeland the body has never seen, but the something inside the body still half remembers. Children, before they learn the words to hide it, often speak of this. They draw houses with too many suns. They describe places they say they used to live. They mention in passing faces they could not have met. Adults usually smile and move on, because the world we have built has no space for such reports. But the feeling, smoothed and quietened, never quite leaves. It sits beneath ordinary days like a low note under a long song. Some have wondered if homesickness without a home is the most honest emotion the human heart contains, a small persistent signal that the address on the soul does not quite match the address on the door. Perhaps you have been homesick your whole life. Perhaps that is not a problem to solve. Perhaps it is a clue. Every night, without fanfare, you disappear. You set down the book or the phone, you let your head touch the pillow, and within minutes the person you have been all day quietly dissolves. The thoughts soften, the body grows heavier, the room recedes, and the self that was so certain of its existence a moment ago is simply gone. No one mourns this nightly vanishing. We call it rest, but it is, when you think about it, the strangest thing the human animal does. For a third of every life, the lights go out. The body remains, breathing, repairing, dreaming, but the you who was reading these very words, the one who was making plans and remembering childhood, is no longer present in any way you can describe. Where exactly did that one go? And how does it return so reliably in the morning as if nothing happened? Neuroscientists studying sleep have mapped the stages carefully. There is the slow descent into deeper and slower brain rhythms, the long quiet stretches where the body restores itself, and the strange electric chapter known as REM, when the brain becomes nearly as active as it is in waking life. Yet the dreamer is paralyzed, locked in safety, and somewhere else entirely. During REM, the dreaming mind builds whole worlds in seconds. Skies, streets, faces, conversations, emotions, weather, all assembled out of nothing visible. And while it lasts, the dream feels to the dreamer exactly as real as this room feels to you now. This is a quietly enormous detail. The brain on its own can generate a complete sensory reality, indistinguishable from waking, populated by people who do not exist and places that have never been built. If it can do this nightly, the question becomes uncomfortable in the most interesting way. How sure are we, really, about the texture of the reality we are in right now? But there is a softer thread to follow here, and it is the one that matters tonight. Many traditions have suspected that sleep is more than restoration. They have called it a small death, a daily rehearsal, a temporary returning. The ancients noticed something the science confirms only gently. When you sleep, something seems to step away from the body without leaving it. You are unreachable, and yet present, absent, and yet not gone. The body lies on the bed like a coat folded over a chair, and the one who was wearing it has slipped for a few hours into another room. Each morning that one returns. The eyes open, the world is back, the story resumes, and almost no one stops to ask the small, astonishing question hidden inside this routine. If something in me can leave each night and return each morning, then something in me is not entirely fused to this body. There is at least a soft door. There is at least a quiet hinge. Some have wondered whether sleep is practice, a gentle nightly reminder, repeated thousands of times across a life, that the body is not the boundary, that the wearer can put the costume down and pick it up again. That, when the longer night eventually arrives, what happens may not be unfamiliar, only longer, only deeper, only the next morning taking a different shape entirely. There are certain moments, rare and unannounced, when something in you breaks open without warning. A sunset of an unreasonable color, the first time you hear a piece of music that seems to know you, a line in a book that lands like a memory, the face of someone you love, lit by ordinary lamplight, suddenly luminous beyond explanation. The throat tightens, the eyes wet themselves, something inside you bows. These moments are difficult to defend in evolutionary terms. From a strictly survival point of view, a sunset is irrelevant. The sky doing remarkable things over the horizon does not improve your odds of finding food or escaping danger. And yet, when the colors arrange themselves a certain way, an entire human being can come to a quiet stop, look up, and feel briefly recalibrated. The animal in us was not asked. Something else responded. Researchers studying awe have noticed how strange this emotion really is. Awe expands the sense of self while simultaneously shrinking it. It tends to reduce focus on personal worries. It seems to widen moral concern, gently increasing the desire to be kind to strangers. It slows time. It softens the boundary between self and surroundings. In brain studies, awe lights up areas associated with meaning, attention, and a kind of quiet self-forgetting. It behaves less like a survival mechanism and more like a signal from somewhere further in. And then there is beauty. Why should the curve of a particular flower, or the symmetry of a face, or the sound of a cello bow on a long, low note move a creature whose primary task is to eat, sleep, mate, and avoid predators? A purely functional being would have no use for these. A purely functional being would not weep at music, would not stand silently before a painting, would not feel a small reverence at the sight of snow falling on an empty street, yet we do. Almost universally, across every culture that has ever been studied, humans report being deeply, sometimes inexplicably, moved by beauty. The materials change, the themes shift, the forms vary, but the underlying response is recognizable everywhere, as if there is a foreign language inside us, and beauty, occasionally, is one of the few words that translates. Some have wondered whether joy of this kind is not native to this place at all, whether the disproportionate intensity of certain experiences, the way they overflow what the moment objectively contains, is a small leak from somewhere else, as though for an instant the thin wall between this life and a wider, deeper background grew briefly translucent, and a familiar light fell through. Children sometimes describe this best because they have not yet learnt to be embarrassed. They will stop in the middle of a field, completely still, and say nothing for a long time. They will press a flower to their cheek with a seriousness adults find amusing. They are not performing, they are receiving. They have not yet been taught that the world is supposed to be ordinary. Perhaps joy is the language of a place you cannot quite recall, a language no one taught you, but which, in certain rare moments, you still understand. And in those moments, something in you remembers, very briefly, that you have heard this music before. There is a particular tiredness that has nothing to do with the body. You can have slept well, eaten properly, exercised, and still, somewhere around the middle of an ordinary day, a soft heaviness will settle over the shoulders that no nap will lift. It is not physical. It is not even really emotional. It is something closer to the weight of being, the weight of carrying a self, a story, a continuity, a noticing, hour after hour, year after year, without rest. No other animal seems to carry this particular load. A deer in a field does not appear burdened by being a deer. A cat does not lie awake at 3 a.m, oppressed by the responsibility of being a cat. But the human, even in the most comfortable circumstances, often reports a quiet exhaustion that is not adequately explained by anything in the day. We sigh, we stare into the middle distance, we feel, sometimes, that simply existing requires effort we did not sign up for. Philosophers and contemplatives across many traditions have circled this strange weight. They have called it the burden of self-awareness. The cost of being a creature who knows it is a creature. Other animals seem to be embedded in their experience. We are simultaneously inside our experience and watching it, narrating it, judging it, comparing it to imagined alternatives. It is as though we are required to live our lives and write the review at the same time. Researchers studying what is sometimes called embodied cognition have found that the body and mind are far more entangled than older models suggested. Stress lives in the shoulders, grief settles in the chest. Long-held emotional tension can show up as physical posture, breathing patterns, even the way a person walks across a room. The body is, in some sense, a register of what the mind has been carrying without speaking about. The weight you feel is in part the accumulated residue of being a witness to yourself, but there is something beyond stress here. Even in the quietest, calmest moments of life, this faint heaviness can remain, as if the very act of being a self requires a small, constant effort. The way standing requires a slight ongoing tension in the legs that you only notice when you finally sit down. To be aware that you are aware is to carry a small, invisible mass every moment, all your life. Some have wondered why a creature would be designed this way. Why give an animal the burden of reflection if reflection does not directly help it survive? Why install a watcher inside the watcher when one layer would have been enough? From a purely practical standpoint, the human inner life is wildly overbuilt for the tasks of a body on a planet, unless, of course, the inner life is not for this place, unless the depth was installed for somewhere else, and what feels here like weight is simply equipment too rich for the journey it is currently being used on. When you lie down tonight and that soft, nameless tiredness settles over you, consider that it might not be a flaw in your life. It might be the gentle ache of carrying something larger than this world was built to hold. Step outside on a clear night, in a place dark enough to see the older stars, and let your eyes adjust slowly. What appears above you, scattered across the depth of the sky, is not random. The universe you are looking into is held together by a small handful of numbers, constants, quiet, fixed values, woven into the laws of physics, which decide what is possible and what is not. And these numbers, when examined carefully, sit at strange and astonishing settings. Physicists studying the structure of the cosmos have noticed that the universe appears to rest on what some have called knife edges. The strength of gravity, the masses of certain particles, the precise force binding the parts of an atom, the rate at which the early universe expanded, the balance between matter and its strange mirror, antimatter. Each of these constants seems tuned to values that allow stars to form, planets to cool, chemistry to function, water to remain liquid, and life of any kind to develop. Adjust almost any of them by a tiny fraction, and the entire stage collapses. No stars, no carbon, no bodies, no watchers. Cosmologists have a name for this. They call it fine-tuning. It is one of the quieter mysteries at the edge of modern physics. The universe behaves as though it were dialed in, a radio tuned with surprising care to a single, narrow frequency where existence becomes possible. The dials, as far as anyone can tell, had no obvious reason to land where they did. There are many proposed explanations for this, and we will treat them all with gentle openness. Some physicists suggest there may be many universes, an unimaginable number of them, with different settings, and we naturally find ourselves in one of the rare ones tuned for observers. Others propose that some deeper, undiscovered law forces the constants to take the values they have. Others sit with the possibility that the tuning is not accidental at all, that there is intention behind the settings. The honest answer, from inside the science itself, is that no one fully knows. But notice what the data by itself gently implies. The stage on which all of human life is performed is built with strange precision, almost as if it were prepared, almost as if someone, before the curtain rose, had been very careful with the lighting. Now consider this softly. If you walked into an empty theatre and found the seats arranged, the temperature comfortable, the air still, the lights warm, the script already laid on a music stand, you would not, even for a moment, believe the room had assembled itself for you by accident. You would assume, quite naturally, that the room had been prepared. You would assume there was a host. This does not prove anything. The universe is not a theatre, and we are not its only audience. But the suggestion that the stage feels prepared is not religious sentiment. It is, increasingly, the quiet shape of the physics itself. So, when you look up tonight, consider that the same arrangement of constants that lights the most distant galaxies is the one that allows the small warmth in your fingertips. The stage was set delicately enough that you could stand on it. Visitors, perhaps. But visitors expected. Inside almost every cell of your body, there is a long, twisting molecule that holds a kind of writing. Not metaphorical writing, actual writing. A sequence of chemical letters arranged in a particular order that tells your cells how to build you. This molecule is DNA, and the information it carries is so dense that a single gram of it could, in theory, hold more data than every digital storage device humanity has ever manufactured. Consider how strange this is. You are walking around with libraries inside you. Each cell, smaller than the eye can see, contains a complete instruction manual for an entire human being. The color of your eyes, the shape of your fingerprints, the way your immune system responds to a particular virus, the rough length of your fingers, even subtle tendencies and temperament are all encoded in this quiet language, written before you were born, copied trillions of times without your knowledge. In every other context, when we find a language, we look for the one who wrote it. Letters on a page imply a writer. Code in a machine implies a programmer. Information in every example we can examine comes from a mind. We have never, in any laboratory, seen a meaningful language assemble itself from random noise. Random ink on paper does not become a novel. Random keystrokes do not produce a working program. There is something about coherent information that always seems to point back, eventually, to intention. Biologists, of course, have proposed mechanisms by which the genetic code may have arisen and diversified. Natural selection, deep time, chemistry on the early Earth. These processes are well studied, and they explain a great deal about how the code changes once it exists. The deeper question, the one that still hangs softly in the air, is how the language got started. How meaningful sequences first arose. How the alphabet, the grammar, the punctuation, the editing systems came into being all together. Many scientists who have looked closely at this admit, quietly, that the origin of biological information remains one of the great open questions. Some have wondered whether the very existence of a code inside us is a kind of signature. Not a name, not a sentence, just the fact that the inside of life is written rather than chaotic, a whisper carved into the smallest places of every creature, suggesting that information, where you find it, tends to come from somewhere. Think of a piece of music you love. The notes are not random, they have been chosen. You do not need to know the composer personally to know that there was one. The structure itself implies authorship. What is happening inside your body, in this very moment, is more elaborate than any symphony ever written. Trillions of cells reading their instructions, replicating, repairing, communicating, all according to a script of staggering precision. You are not merely alive, you are being recited. And so a soft question lingers, refusing to be hurried. If information tends to imply a source, and you are made of information arranged into a living being, then perhaps the most personal book in existence is being whispered, even now, beneath your skin, authored quietly, author unnamed in the text itself. Here is something easy to forget, because we grow up surrounded by it. The universe obeys mathematics, not loosely, not approximately, with astonishing, almost suspicious precision. The motion of the planets, the behavior of light, the strange dance of subatomic particles, the curve of a thrown stone, all of it described by equations a mind can write down on a single page. This sounds ordinary until you consider how unlikely it really is. Mathematics is, at its core, an abstract activity. It is something done in the head, with symbols, in silence. A mathematician sitting in a quiet room can invent an idea purely out of logic, with no reference to the physical world, and then, decades or even centuries later, someone discovers that the universe was secretly using that exact idea all along. The physicist Eugene Wigner once wrote about this with the kind of awe you usually reserve for sunsets. He called it the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. He was pointing at something almost embarrassingly strange. Why should the inside of the mind match the outside of the world? Why should a creature that evolved, supposedly, just to gather food and avoid predators on a small planet, be able to derive equations that describe the behavior of stars billions of light years away? Imagine handing a child, raised in a quiet village, a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope, you are told, is a description of every river, mountain, and city on a continent they have never visited. The child opens the envelope, draws lines using only logic and imagination, and somehow every line corresponds to a real river, every mark, a real mountain, every loop, an actual city, in its exact place. You would, quite reasonably, find this unnerving. This is, in a soft sense, what the human mind has been doing with mathematics. From inside our own quiet thinking, we have been able to draw maps that match reality at scales we have never directly seen. The orbits of distant planets, the behavior of objects moving at nearly the speed of light, the strange statistics of the very small, the shape of space itself. Equations written in pencil have predicted, again and again, what the universe was going to do before instruments confirmed it. There are two possibilities here, and both are quietly remarkable. One is that mathematics is somehow built into the structure of reality itself, woven into its bones, and we, miraculously, have access to it. The other is that the human mind was somehow pre-tuned to the universe, calibrated, before birth, before evolution had any reason to bother, to think in the same language the cosmos is written in. Either way, the match between mind and world is too tight to be casually dismissed. It is as though the lock and the key were carved by someone who knew both. Some have wondered whether this is another small clue. The mind, after all, would not need to be cosmic to survive on a planet. A simpler brain would have done. The fact that the inside of you understands the inside of galaxies suggests that whatever you are made for, it was something larger than the field beneath your feet. You have lived your whole life inside a current you cannot see. It carries you forward at a pace you do not control. Each morning is delivered. Each evening is taken away. The faces around you slowly change. The mirror, over decades, gradually edits itself. You call this time, and you assume quietly that it is the same for everyone and the same everywhere. It is not. Just over a century ago, a young physicist sat in a patent office and began to suspect that time was strange. Through a series of careful thought experiments and the equations that followed, Einstein gently dismantled an assumption humanity had carried for thousands of years. Time, he showed, is not a fixed background against which events happen. It bends, it stretches, it slows, it speeds, depending on how fast you move and how close you are to massive objects. Your seconds do not match the seconds of someone elsewhere. This is not philosophy. It is measurable. Atomic clocks flown on aeroplanes return out of step with identical clocks left on the ground. Satellites in orbit have to be corrected continuously because their time runs at a slightly different rate than ours. Astronauts on the space station, in a small, quiet way, age more slowly than the rest of us. Near a black hole, the effect becomes extreme. A traveler floating close to one could, in their own experience, spend only minutes, while back home, generations pass. Let that settle for a moment. Time is not a wall. It is a soft cage. The bars bend. The whole thing is more like weather than architecture. Yet inside this strangeness, something in us suspects that our own experience of time is even stranger than physics describes. A childhood summer can feel longer than an entire decade in middle age. A moment of great fear can stretch into what feels like a quarter hour. A night with someone you love can collapse into a heartbeat. Subjective time obeys its own quiet rhythms, as though there is an inner clock that is not entirely synchronized with the outer one. People who have come close to death often describe, with surprising consistency, an experience of time becoming suddenly elastic. Whole life reviews unfolding in seconds, the present widening into something that does not seem to belong to the calendar at all. These reports are too varied and too widespread to be casually dismissed, and many serious researchers have begun gently studying them. Some have wondered whether this hints at something deeper, If physics already tells us that time is flexible, and if the inner sense of time can run at speeds the clock disagrees with, perhaps the part of us that is doing the noticing is not entirely a citizen of clocks at all. Perhaps the observer inside you is loosely bound to the calendar, less imprisoned by minutes than the body is. If you have ever felt, in a long sleepless night, or a deep meditative quiet, that you were briefly outside of time, you may not have been imagining it. The cage of hours may be softer than it looks, and the wearer of the body may keep a different watch than the wrist it sits on. Sit quietly for a moment, if you can, and notice the thoughts moving through your mind. Notice the next one arrive. Notice it pass. Notice another take its place. Now gently, ask a question that has unsettled philosophers for centuries. Who is doing the noticing? If your thoughts are you, then you cannot watch them. You would simply be them. But there is, undeniably, something watching. Something behind the thought, slightly apart from it, observing without effort. The thought arises, the thought is seen, the thought subsides, and the seer remains. This quiet inner witness has been described in nearly every contemplative tradition on earth, and modern psychology has begun, in its own careful language, to circle the same observation. There is a famous set of experiments in neuroscience involving people whose brains, for medical reasons, have had the bridge between the two hemispheres surgically cut. These split brain patients reveal something unsettling about the architecture of the mind. The two halves of the brain can sometimes know different things at the same time. One side can see an image the other side cannot describe. One hand can reach for an object while the other has no idea why. Researchers studying these cases have observed that the brain seems at times to host more than one stream of awareness, gently coordinated but not entirely fused. And yet in ordinary daily life you do not feel like a committee. You feel like one. Behind the noise, behind the inner debate, behind the conflicting urges and shifting moods, there is a singular sense of presence that does not seem to splinter even when the brain itself, physically, is divided. Something underneath the mechanism appears to remain whole. Try a small experiment. Recall a memory from when you were 5 years old. Now recall a memory from 10 years ago. Now notice the present moment. The body has changed entirely between those points. The brain has been rewired countless times. The opinions, the fears, the friendships, the language have all shifted, and yet the I who remembers being 5 is the same I who is here now, listening. The witness has not aged. The witness has only watched aging. This is, when you let yourself feel it, deeply strange. Everything about you that is physical has been replaced or remodeled. Everything about you that is psychological has been edited many times. But the silent presence behind it all, the bare fact of someone is here noticing, has carried through unbroken. Some have wondered whether this inner witness is the part of you that does not actually belong to the body at all. The body is the moving picture, the witness is the screen, the thoughts are the weather, the witness is the sky. Whatever it is, it does not appear to be made of the same material as the rest. You do not need to decide anything about it tonight. You only need to notice, softly, that it is there. The one who has been hearing these words is not the words. The one who is feeling sleepy is not the sleepiness. The one inside the costume of cells is not the costume. And that one, whatever it is, has been waiting patiently to be remembered. There is a curious pattern hidden in the oldest stories humanity has ever told. Look across the sacred and ancient texts of unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, with no possibility of having borrowed from one another, and you will find, again and again, a strange agreement. They almost all say, in their own languages, that humans did not begin here. In the texts of the ancient Near East, the first humans walk in a garden, in the cool of the evening, in the company of something greater than themselves. In old Persian writings, the soul descends from a place of light into a heavier, dimmer world for a purpose. In ancient Egyptian funerary texts, the dead are not strangers to the afterworld, but returning travelers, recalling names and gates they once knew. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, layered worlds extend above and below this one, and the human plane is described as a kind of middle station, neither home nor exile, but visit. Anthropologists who study these stories without belief one way or the other have noted with some surprise how persistent this motif is. The myth of an original elsewhere, a homeland from which we came, a descent, a temporary placement, a trial, a return. Cultures that never met, with completely different languages, gods, and rituals, somehow keep telling versions of the same story. Something has been remembered, perhaps imperfectly, across many tongues. There is a particular sentence found, in different forms, in several of these traditions, and it is striking once you notice it. Humans, the old texts often say, were made from the dust of this place but breathed into by something that came from elsewhere. The body in these accounts is local. The breath, the something inside, is not. This is of course not proof of anything. Stories repeat for many reasons: common psychological needs, shared human cognitive structures, the simple fact that all humans dream, grieve, hope, and die, and these realities tend to produce overlapping symbols. But the consistency is, at minimum, worth a quiet pause. When a single message keeps arriving in many envelopes from many directions, written by people who never coordinated, even a careful skeptic begins to wonder whether some signal underlies the noise. Among these traditions, there is one strand that speaks with particular directness. It says that long before this life, a covenant was made, that every soul, while still in a state more luminous than this, was asked a question and answered it, and was then placed here, briefly, to remember. It says the world we walk in is not punishment but examination. It says there will be a return, and that the return will be the easier part. The harder part is the visit. You do not need to accept any of this tonight. You only need to notice that the old books, in many languages, have been whispering something quite similar for a very long time, and the small voice inside, the one that has always suspected this place is not quite home, has perhaps been listening to those whispers all along, without knowing where they were coming from. There is an experience almost every human has had, at least once, and almost no one can explain. You're in an ordinary place doing an ordinary thing, when suddenly the whole moment seems to shimmer with the unsettling sense that it has happened before. The angle of the light, the position of someone's hand, the particular sentence being spoken, you stop, you feel for the briefest instant that you are not living this moment for the first time, but remembering it. We call this déjà vu, a French phrase meaning already seen. Neurologists have offered several explanations. Perhaps a small delay between two parallel streams of perception creates the illusion of a memory. Perhaps a part of the brain responsible for familiarity briefly activates without a real memory to attach to. These are plausible mechanisms, and they may well be correct as descriptions of the wiring, but mechanisms do not always answer the deeper question: why does the experience feel so emotionally specific? Why does it so often arrive with a small hushed sense that there is something you have just missed remembering? Something that, if you could only catch the edge of it, would explain a great deal. There is a softer cousin of déjà vu, less often discussed, but possibly even stranger. The sudden, unprompted feeling of recognition when meeting a particular person, or seeing a particular landscape for the first time, and feeling, oddly, that you used to live there, or hearing an idea that you have never been taught, and yet experiencing it as a confirmation of something you have always quietly known. Children, again, are unusually transparent here. Researchers studying young children have collected striking reports of small ones speaking, before any cultural conditioning, of places, faces, and events that no one in their immediate world could explain. These accounts come from many cultures and many decades, and serious investigators have approached them with appropriate caution. The data is gentle, not conclusive, but it lingers. There is an idea present in several ancient traditions that before this life began, every conscious being was asked a question. The question was simple: do you accept this journey and the responsibilities that come with it? And every soul, the story says, answered yes. The answer was given in a state of clarity that is no longer accessible to us in this dimmer place. Then a veil was drawn, the memory was sealed, the journey began. If something like this is true, then almost every confusing moment in human life becomes suddenly, gently coherent. The faint sense that you have been here before, the persistent intuition that you owe something, though you cannot remember what, the strange seriousness with which you take your own life, far beyond what mere survival would warrant, the unease that visits even the most comfortable evenings, the whisper that says, "Do not forget what you came here to do," when you cannot even remember coming. You do not need to recall the oath consciously. The oath, in this telling, was not stored where waking memory could reach. It was placed deeper, beneath the layers that this life would build, far enough below that you could enter the test honestly, without the answer key, but not so far that nothing of it would ever reach the surface. That faint stirring, when life suddenly feels weighted with a meaning you cannot quite name, may be the only echo permitted through. A signal pulse from the moment you said yes, gently reminding the visitor that there was once a beginning before the beginning, a promise made, a door entered, a path accepted, even if the path is now being walked in the dark. It is easy to feel that forgetting is a flaw. We lose names, dates, the texture of childhood afternoons, the faces of people we once loved. We strain to recall what we had for dinner 3 nights ago. We carry, somewhere inside, an embarrassed sense that a better mind would remember more. But if you look closely at how memory actually works, you begin to suspect that forgetting is not a bug at all. It is a feature, and it may be one of the most important features of all. Neuroscientists studying memory have learned that the brain is, in a sense, constantly editing. It does not simply record everything the way a camera might. It selects, it compresses, it discards. The vast majority of sensory input is allowed to evaporate, because if it did not, awareness would drown. A person who literally remembers everything, a rare and well-documented condition, often finds it disabling rather than empowering. The river of detail crushes the moment. Without forgetting, there is no room to live, and there is something even deeper here. Most adults cannot remember anything from their first 2 or 3 years of life. This phenomenon, known as childhood amnesia, is universal and consistent. Some of the most formative experiences of a human being, the moments when language is being learned, when bonds are being formed, when the very shape of personality is being laid down, are systematically erased from the conscious record. Why would nature build a memory system that hides the most foundational years of life from its owner? One quiet possibility is that some kinds of experience are too sacred or too soft to survive direct examination. They must be installed and then sealed. The infant builds a sense of self, of being held, of being seen, but the receipts are taken away so that the structure remains rather than the bookkeeping. Now extend this principle a little further, gently, into stranger territory. Imagine a journey that requires absolute honesty, a test in which knowing the answers in advance would invalidate the result. For such a journey to be meaningful, you would need to enter it with the answer key removed. You would need to forget that you ever held it. It is, when you think about it, the only way a real choice could be made. If you remembered in vivid detail every consequence of every option, you would not be choosing. You would be calculating. If you remembered the place you came from, the journey here would lose its weight, because you would simply be waiting to return. The veil over memory may not be a malfunction. It may be the necessary condition that makes the trip worth taking. Some have wondered whether this is why almost every contemplative tradition has spoken of life as a forgetting and the spiritual path as a remembering. Not the recovery of facts, but the gentle rediscovery of orientation. The way one slowly remembers a dream upon waking, in pieces, never fully, but enough to know that something was being lived through. Notice, then, that the things you cannot remember are not necessarily lost. They may simply be held in a place you cannot reach with the daylight mind. Behind the veil, waiting, stored carefully so that the journey here would have weight, so that your choices made in the dim would count. The forgetting is not the failure. The forgetting is the room in which the real choosing takes place. If you sit quietly and watch your own mind for any length of time, you begin to notice something peculiar. There are, inside you, two voices. They do not always speak loudly. They often speak in the same person's tone, but they want different things. One of them is fast. It is the voice that wants the second piece of cake before the first is finished. The voice that snaps at someone you love when you are tired. The voice that scrolls one more video when the body is begging for sleep. The voice that looks at a stranger's pain and looks away. This voice is not evil. It is simply hungry. It is concerned with the immediate, the visible, the easy, the now. The other voice is slower. It speaks more softly. It is the voice that, in the quiet just after the snap, says, "You should not have said that." The voice that nudges you to return the wallet you found, even though no one would know. The voice that wakes you at 2 in the morning and asks whether the way you have been living is really the way you want to be remembered. This voice is not preachy. It is patient. It waits. Psychologists have given names to something resembling this. Dual process theory describes the brain as operating in 2 modes, a fast automatic mode that handles immediate reactions, and a slower, more deliberate mode that handles reflection, conscience, and long-range thinking. The 2 are not enemies. They are tools designed for different terrains, but almost every human knows the experience of the 2 pulling in different directions at the same time. Now notice something easy to miss. The faster pull is more or less explainable in terms of biology. We are animals. Animals seek pleasure and avoid pain. The evolutionary case for short-term hunger and self-protection is straightforward, but the slower pull is harder to account for in purely survival terms. Why should a creature evolved to outcompete others be quietly burdened, in the middle of the night, by the suspicion that it has been unkind? Why should the act of returning a stranger's lost wallet, with no chance of reward, produce a small, almost involuntary sense of rightness? Why should there be, alongside the appetite for advantage, a clear, unforced ache for something that looks suspiciously like goodness? Some have wondered whether the 2 pulls are not merely 2 strategies of the same animal, but 2 citizenships of the same traveller. The first voice is fluent in this world. It belongs here. It speaks the local language. The second voice is older. It speaks softly, often in a language the surface mind half forgets, and it keeps measuring this life against a standard the surface mind cannot quite name. That standard is suspicious. It does not seem to be learned. Small children, before they have been formally instructed, already show a faint, fragile sense of fairness. Across very different cultures, people independently arrive at remarkably similar feelings about cruelty, honesty, courage, gratitude. Something inside us appears to have a built-in measuring stick we did not pick up from our surroundings. Perhaps the second voice is the part of you that still remembers the place you came from. Quietly comparing this life to a homeland of light it no longer has the words for. Not lecturing, not commanding, just steadily, patiently, asking the visitor whether they are still walking in the direction they once promised they would walk. No one would design a journey that hurts, unless the hurt was teaching something, and yet the journey called human life contains, woven through it, an extraordinary amount of difficulty. Loss, illness, disappointment, loneliness, the slow ache of unmet hope, the sudden break of a heart. Almost no one escapes any of it, and almost no philosophy ever invented has been able to fully explain it away. This is one of the hardest things to talk about gently. So let us go slowly. Psychologists in recent decades have studied something they call post-traumatic growth. It is, in some sense, the quieter twin of post-traumatic stress. While trauma can wound deeply, researchers have noticed that a meaningful percentage of people, after passing through serious hardship, report something they did not expect: a deepening of meaning, a clearer sense of priorities, a softer presence with others who are suffering, an expansion rather than a collapse of the inner life. This does not mean suffering is good. It is not. Pain is real, and the desire to avoid it is honest. The point is more subtle. The data quietly shows that human beings, given enough time and care, can sometimes alchemize hardship into wisdom in a way that pure comfort never seems to produce. There is something about being broken that, in the right conditions, opens a door that ease leaves closed. Almost no one becomes deeply compassionate without having needed compassion. Almost no one becomes spiritually serious without having stood in a room where nothing in this world could reach them. Almost no one truly understands the value of a small kindness until they have been on the receiving end of one when they had nothing left to give in return. The most profound human beings, again and again, turn out to have been students of grief. This pattern is so consistent that it begins to look less like an accident and more like part of the design. Some have wondered whether suffering, in this life, functions less like a malfunction and more like a curriculum, difficult subjects assigned not to punish but to develop, material that cannot be skipped because the qualities it builds cannot be taught any other way. Think of how patience is formed, not in moments when nothing tests it, but in long, slow afternoons when something does. Think of how empathy is formed, not in pristine isolation, but in the quiet humility of having been hurt and noticing what hurt feels like from the inside. Think of how trust is formed, not in calm rooms, but in the slow recovery from a wound, when a person discovers they can survive having been wounded. It is possible, of course, that suffering is simply random, and that any meaning we find in it is improvised after the fact. That view deserves respect, but many serious thinkers from many traditions, including modern researchers studying meaning-making in adversity, have noticed how unusually often the human spirit refuses to leave suffering meaningless, even when no consolation is offered, even when the loss cannot be undone. Something in us keeps trying to extract a teaching, as though it knows there is one buried somewhere in the weight. Perhaps that is because, at some level beneath language, the visitor inside the costume knows what the visitor came for. Not comfort, not entertainment, not even, ultimately, happiness as we usually picture it, but becoming. Slowly, painfully, honestly, becoming the kind of being who could one day walk back through the door from which they originally came, and not be ashamed of who they had grown into along the way. Lift your eyes for a moment, slowly, away from this story, and consider the scale of time you have actually been allotted. 80 years, 90 perhaps, if you are gentle with the body and lucky with the weather. 100, in rare cases, if the genes were generous. Beyond that, almost no one, whatever you accomplish, whatever you build, whatever you become, has to be done inside this remarkably narrow strip of hours. Now widen the lens. The planet beneath you is about 4.5 billion years old. The universe itself is closer to 14 billion. The stars that have formed and died before your great-great-grandparents were born outnumber the grains of sand on every beach. Civilizations have risen and fallen in periods so old that the languages they spoke can no longer be reconstructed. Cities you would have called eternal lie, buried under 30 feet of quiet earth. Against this enormous backdrop, a human life is a flicker, a single breath of the cosmos. Many of the people you have ever met will be entirely forgotten within 4 or 5 generations. The street you live on may not exist in 1,000 years. The country you were born in, whatever it is, on geological scales, very young and very temporary. This should, by every reasonable calculation, depress us. And yet, strangely, it usually does not. Most humans, in most cultures, walk around as if they will be here for a long time. We make plans for next decade. We take grudges with us across years. We feel insulted by small things, as though we had enough time to spare for small things. We act, very often, like permanent residents of a place we are in fact passing through. This is the part that has puzzled philosophers for thousands of years. Why does a creature with so short a stay so consistently behave as though staying were the point? Why does permanence feel native to us, even though nothing about our circumstances justifies the assumption? Why does the heart instinctively recoil from death, not just on practical grounds, but with a deeper protest, as though death were a violation of the natural order rather than its most reliable feature? Some have wondered whether this stubborn instinct toward permanence is itself a kind of evidence. Other animals do not appear to share it in the same form. A deer does not seem to consider its own mortality across decades and feel cosmically affronted by it. Only humans seem to live, at the back of the mind, as though they were not really meant to be temporary, as though the brevity were the unusual condition, and continuity were what was originally promised. If the soul were entirely native to this place, you would expect it to feel at peace with the timescales of this place. You would expect a creature designed for 80 years to feel that 80 years was enough. Instead, almost without exception, people in the final stages of long lives report a quiet sense that the journey ended too soon, not in the sense of regret, in the sense of I had only just begun. Perhaps then, the part of you that cannot accept the brevity is not deluded. Perhaps it is correctly remembering a longer timescale, the one from which it came and the one to which it is heading. Perhaps the visit is short because the visit was always meant to be short, not because life is small, but because the visit is only the first sentence of a story that continues, in another language, long after the chapter set on this planet has gently closed. Tucked inside the oldest stories told by almost every human culture is the same quiet image: a garden, a place of light and water and gentle abundance, a place where the first humans walked without shame, in the presence of something larger than themselves. The details change, the names change, the plants change, but the garden, in one form or another, keeps appearing, as though every human culture had been recalling, imperfectly, the same memory. In the texts of the ancient Near East, there is Eden, a green and watered place, inhabited briefly before a kind of separation. In Persian traditions, there is Paradisa, the walled garden, the original meaning of the word paradise itself. In ancient Greek imagination, there are the Elysian fields and the gardens of the Hesperides, far across distant waters. In Norse stories, there is the orchard of Eden, where apples renew the gods. In Chinese mythology, the peaches of the Western Queen Mother grow in a hidden, fragrant orchard. In indigenous traditions across the Americas, there are accounts of an original world before this one, more luminous, where humans lived in closeness to the makers of all things. Anthropologists studying mythology, including some who came at the question with no spiritual agenda whatsoever, have noted with quiet surprise how persistent this image is. The first humans, in so many tellings, are not described as ascending out of darkness. They are described as having descended or been placed from somewhere brighter. The original state is almost always remembered as gentler. The current state is almost always understood as something that came after. You could read this many ways. Some have read it as a shared psychological structure, a story humans naturally invent because we all once experienced infancy, that warm and watered time when we were carried, fed and protected. Others have read it as folk memory of the agricultural revolution, when human life shifted from foraging amid abundance to laboring against a less yielding earth. These readings are reasonable. They explain some of the texture, but they do not quite explain the emotional weight. They do not explain why hearing the story, even told plainly, still seems to land somewhere very deep. Why people who have never been religious can feel a strange tug at the description of a garden they have never seen. Why the imagery shows up in dreams, in art, in literature, in advertising, in the longing felt at the edge of forests. Perhaps, gently, there is a third possibility, not instead of the others, but alongside them. Perhaps the garden keeps appearing because something in the human soul is remembering it. Not as a literal map, but as an inner orientation, the original setting, the first scene, the one before all the others, when humans across vastly different cultures, with no possibility of borrowing, all independently describe their beginnings as a luminous garden from which they have somehow stepped away. The simplest explanation may not be coincidence. It may be that the storyteller inside us, the one beneath language, has been trying for thousands of years to communicate something about where we came from. Tonight, you do not need to believe any particular version. You only need to notice that the garden has been showing up, again and again in human imagination for as long as there has been human imagination, as though the inside of every person, beneath the noise of this present life, still keeps a small lamp lit, pointing back toward a place that was almost certainly real before it became a story. Pause for a moment and consider what moves you, the actual things in the actual world that have ever made you stop walking, lower your phone, and simply look. Some patterns repeat across nearly every human heart, regardless of culture, language, or upbringing. Symmetry, water, light, open horizons, trees, mountains lit from behind by an evening sun, the face of someone you love, music that follows certain proportions of sound and silence. Almost every human, almost everywhere, has been quietly moved by some version of these. Researchers studying aesthetics have noticed, with some surprise, how consistent these preferences are. Babies, far before any cultural training, show preference for symmetrical faces. Adults across radically different societies tend to favor landscapes containing water, trees, and a slight elevation, as though some inner script were still rating environments. Mathematicians and architects have, for thousands of years, observed that certain proportions, repeated in nature, in cathedrals, in seashells, in galaxies, seem to please the eye in ways that are difficult to argue with. This is, when you sit with it, strange. From a strictly survival standpoint, the universe could have produced creatures who are merely indifferent to beauty. Beauty is not nutrition. Beauty does not by itself build shelter, and yet the human animal is built such that the right arrangement of light on water, or the right curve of a hillside against the sky, can stop a person mid-stride and leave them, briefly, more whole than they were a moment before. Some have wondered whether this means our senses are calibrated to something they have not yet directly encountered, as though the eye were tuned, before birth, for a specific kind of light, as though the ear were prepared in advance for a music it has not yet heard, as though the heart had been outfitted with receivers for signals it would only occasionally pick up in this world, but which it instantly recognizes when they arrive. Consider how a homing pigeon released far from its loft does not simply wander. Something inside it knows, before the journey begins, what it is heading toward. It does not need to have seen the loft from this angle before. The orientation is already inside. Perhaps something similar is happening, more quietly, in the human reaction to certain kinds of beauty. A particular green meadow, a particular fall of light through high windows, a particular silence after a particular phrase of music. These moments, when they arrive, do not feel like surprises. They feel like confirmations. It is interesting to notice that all of the imagery used by the oldest traditions to describe a luminous origin, gardens, flowing water, beings of light, gentle and abundant landscapes, lines up with almost exactly the things human beings universally find most beautiful here, almost as if our taste in this world was shaped by what we loved in the place before it. You may have noticed this in your own life. The unreasonable peace of standing near a clear stream, the slight catch of breath at certain sunsets, the way candlelight, of all things, can soften an entire room into something that feels almost remembered. These reactions are not random, they are consistent. They are universal enough to suggest that the human aesthetic sense is pointing somewhere. Perhaps the geometry of what moves you is the architecture of a homeland you have not seen with these eyes. Beauty here, on this planet, is gentle enough to remind you, strong enough to almost wake you, quiet enough not to give the whole thing away. Almost everyone has had at least one dream they could not quite shake. Not the ordinary dreams of stress or work or chasing something through familiar streets. A different sort, a dream of a place you have never visited, populated by a particular kind of light, with details so specific that upon waking you can still see the shape of a building, or the color of the sky, or the feel of a road beneath unfamiliar feet. You are sure you have never been there. And yet, on waking, you feel oddly as though you have just come home. Researchers studying dreams have noticed that the sleeping brain is not merely replaying the day. During REM sleep, the brain weaves novel imagery, sometimes drawing on memory, but often producing entire scenes that have no clear source in waking experience. Dream researchers have collected countless reports of recurring dreams set in landscapes the dreamer has never visited, with a consistency of detail that returns night after night across decades. A particular hallway, a particular shoreline, a particular library with a ceiling impossibly high. People describe these places with an almost embarrassed earnestness, as though they suspect the listener will think they are exaggerating. Some say they have been visiting the same recurring dream place since childhood. Some report that their parents and grandparents described similar recurring landscapes, with a few overlapping motifs, though no one in the family had ever been there. There are, of course, plausible mechanisms. The brain may be assembling composite imagery from fragments. The same neural networks may, over time, generate similar internal architecture simply because they share their owner. These explanations may be entirely correct. They certainly account for much of what dreams are, but they do not entirely soften the strangeness of one particular kind of dream, which seems too specific, too gentle, too coherent to be mere static. The dream of a place that feels remembered rather than invented. The dream that leaves a small ache for a few minutes after waking, as though something had briefly been within reach and then withdrawn. Some have wondered whether sleep, in addition to all the things science knows it does for the body and the brain, also opens, occasionally, a softer door. Not always, not even most nights, but sometimes, a door through which something inside the visitor brushes for a moment against the place it came from, not as full recollection, not as clear vision, just as a feeling, a flavor, a pattern of light that you cannot quite describe at breakfast. There are people in palliative care, attended by very serious researchers, who have reported, in the final weeks of life, an increase in dreams of returning, dreams of being greeted, dreams of paths leading somewhere familiar. These reports are not new. They have been recorded across many cultures, in many decades, by clinicians with no particular spiritual investment. The consistency, again, is what gives a careful listener pause. We are not concluding anything tonight. There is no need. The dreams will continue to do what dreams do, with or without our theories. But perhaps when you next wake from a dream that felt unusually clean, with the impression of a landscape that did not belong to your life, you can hold it more softly. Perhaps it was not random imagery, perhaps it was a glimpse, dim and quickly fading, of a place the visitor knew long before this visit began. Sleep brings you many things. Once in a while it may bring you a small whisper of home. If a traveller were sent on a long journey into a place where they would not remember coming from elsewhere, it would be a kindness to leave them messages along the way. Not full instructions, not the complete answer key, which would dissolve the journey itself. Just enough. Quiet reminders, letters slipped under the door, in language the traveller still half understood, so that even in the dim they would not be entirely without direction. This is, in essence, what almost every spiritual tradition has claimed has happened. That at various moments in human history, in different places, in different languages, messages were delivered, sometimes through ordinary people, sometimes through individuals reported to have undergone extraordinary experiences, sometimes in texts, sometimes in oral teachings, sometimes in songs and poems, and these messages, examined side by side, show an unusual amount of agreement on the essential map, even when they disagree on the local geography. They tend to say, in their own words, that this life is not the whole story, that there is a source from which conscious life originally came, that the way a person treats others, especially those who cannot repay them, matters in a way that this world's currencies do not fully measure, that there is a return of some kind after the visit ends, that the visit, while it lasts, is a kind of weighing, and that the visitor is not alone, even when they feel most alone, because something is, in some way, still listening. You can sort these traditions into many categories. You can compare them, contrast them, criticize them, even reject them, but a careful, open-eyed reader, willing to set aside both naive belief and dismissive cynicism, will eventually notice how strange it is that the deepest claims of so many separate sources point in such similar directions, almost as if many different envelopes, sent across different centuries and continents, contained variations of the same letter. Anthropologists call this the unity in spiritual traditions, and they study it with care. They do not have to agree about the source. They simply observe the pattern. Across cultures with no possibility of communication, the same basic concerns appear. Compassion toward the vulnerable, honesty, humility, a reminder that the visible world is not the entire field of meaning, a warning against the slow corruption of the soul through small, comfortable cruelties, a promise that something attends to all of it. This kind of agreement, in such a stubborn and decentralized species as ours, is not nothing. Humans rarely agree about anything. The fact that we have, across thousands of years and unrelated languages, repeatedly arrived at remarkably similar moral and spiritual intuitions suggests that either there is something deeply built into human consciousness, or there is something deeply true in the messages themselves, or both. None of these possibilities is small. Some have wondered whether these traditions, taken together, function as a kind of mercy, a way of softly and repeatedly reminding the amnesiac traveler of what they may have once known. The veil over the original memory is real, but it is not absolute. Light still gets through. Letters still arrive. They do not shout. They do not force. They sit quietly on the table of every culture, waiting to be picked up by anyone curious enough to read. You do not have to choose between them tonight. You do not have to choose anything. You may simply notice that the door of this life, dim as it is, has never been entirely without lamps along its corridors, and that someone, at some point, took care to place them there. Among the many letters left for travellers in this place, there is one in particular that scholars, regardless of personal belief, have often paused over because of how unusually it has survived. It is a text that was delivered in the 7th century in the desert quiet of Arabia. It was not written down by its messenger. It was recited, memorized, word for word by his earliest listeners, passed mouth to mouth and ear to ear with an obsessive precision that would later be supplemented, but never replaced, by writing. What is striking, even to careful secular historians, is how stable this text has remained across more than 14 centuries. Manuscripts found in different parts of the world, separated by enormous geography and time, contain with remarkable consistency the same words in the same order. The earliest surviving fragments, in widely scattered locations, when compared, line up with the recitations still memorized in full today by an estimated tens of millions of living human beings. There is no other text of comparable age that has been transmitted, by both memory and manuscript, with anything close to this preservation. Researchers studying its internal structure have also noted other curiosities. Particular words appear in surprising mathematical balances. The word for life occurs the same number of times as the word for death. The word for this world, this temporary place, is balanced exactly against the word for the next life. Several such symmetries have been catalogued across the text. These patterns alone do not prove anything beyond themselves, but they have invited many serious minds from many backgrounds into a respectful pause. There is also the quality of the language itself. People fluent in classical Arabic, including non-Muslim linguists, have written carefully about the unusual rhythm, density, and acoustic structure of this text. It does not read like poetry, and it does not read like ordinary prose. It occupies a category that scholars of Arabic literature have generally treated as singular. Even those who do not accept its theological claims have acknowledged that, as a piece of language, it stands apart. We are not, tonight, asking anyone to commit to a tradition. The faith-safe spirit of this exploration is gentler than that. We are simply noticing that, among the many quiet letters that have arrived along the corridor of human history, there is one whose preservation, internal patterning, and linguistic precision is statistically and historically unusual enough to merit, at the very least, the dignity of a closer look. Curiosity does no harm. A careful, unhurried reading commits no one to anything except honesty. Some have wondered whether the very fact that this text was so insistently preserved by ordinary people with no central institution forcing them to do so is itself a kind of signal, as though the message inside it were by its own nature the sort of thing that resists being lost, as though something in it somehow kept making sure the message reached the next generation of travelers unaltered. You do not need to agree tonight. You only need to notice that, on the table of letters left in this corridor for visitors who have forgotten where they came from, there is at least one envelope that has been handled with extraordinary care across very many hands, across very many centuries. If a traveller suspected they had been placed here for a reason, and that messages from elsewhere might have been left for them, it would not be unreasonable to look, gently and on their own time, at the envelope that, by every available historical measure, seems to have been most carefully kept. There is a quiet feeling that nearly every human carries, often without naming. The feeling that, somewhere underneath the routines of ordinary days, you are being noticed. Not watched in a frightening way, just noticed, as though the things you do, especially the small ones, especially the ones no one else sees, are being gently registered by something attentive. You see this most clearly in the small decisions. You find a wallet in an empty parking lot. No one is around. The cameras are off. You could keep the money, but something in you knows, with a strange and quiet certainty, that to take it would weigh on you in a way that cannot quite be explained by mere social conditioning. The weight does not come from the outside. It comes from a place inside that seems to keep its own record. Moral psychologists studying conscience have noticed that human beings act, with surprising consistency, as though their behavior were being evaluated even when no observer is present. People are kinder when they think they are being watched, of course, but intriguingly, even alone, with all possibility of social judgment removed, most people still feel a low, persistent sense of being assessed. This is so reliable that some researchers have begun to wonder where it actually comes from. There is no easy biological story that fully accounts for it. The presence of a guilty feeling when no one is watching does not, on the surface, offer any survival advantage. If anything, it costs something. The selfish act would be easier without the inner voice complaining. And yet the inner voice is there, in almost every human, almost every day. Some have wondered whether the steady sense of being weighed is in some way accurate. Not paranoid, not theatrical, just gently true, as though this life were not a private holiday but a kind of examination room, not a punishing one, not a fearful one. Simply a quiet space in which what you do, especially what you do when unobserved, is part of what is actually happening, part of why you are here at all. Notice that this does not require, in your imagination tonight, any specific picture of judgment. It does not require fire, or thrones, or theatrical accounting. It requires only the soft possibility that the small actions of a life have a weight that travels with the actor. That the way you spoke to the cashier this morning, the patience or the irritation, the gentleness or the small cruelty, did not evaporate the moment ended. That something somehow was attended to. Examined this way, the unimportant moments stop being unimportant. The brief patience with a slow driver, the way you treated yourself in the bathroom mirror after a hard day, the willingness or refusal to forgive someone who is not asking for forgiveness. The decision to keep listening to a friend whose story has gone on for an hour. These small moments are not extras. They are, possibly, the central material of the examination room. If life is a test, it is not the dramatic kind. It is not the kind where there is a final boss at the end of the corridor. It is the quieter kind. The kind that mostly takes place when no one is looking, in tiny moments stitched together over decades, in which you slowly reveal, to whatever is paying attention, who you were really willing to be when no one was forcing you to be anything in particular. When a human being dies, almost everything they accumulated stays behind. The car, the house, the money, the clothes, the certificates on the walls, the follow account, the job title. All of it remains in the room, like luggage left behind at a station, waiting to be redistributed by the living. The body itself, in time, returns to the earth. Nothing physical accompanies the traveller into whatever comes next. This is so well known that we rarely sit with it. But sit with it now, just for a moment. Almost every effort of a typical life is poured into things that, in the strict accounting of what travels, do not travel. We chase securities that will not follow us. We protect possessions we will not keep. We argue, often, over inheritances of objects we ourselves cannot ultimately take with us. And yet, there appears to be one category of things that does seem in some sense to outlast the body. Not in the visible sense, not as objects, but as effects. People who have spent time near the dying hospice workers, palliative caregivers, end-of-life researchers, have noted with quiet consistency what dying people tend to talk about. They do not, on the whole, talk about their salary. They do not, on the whole, discuss their cars or their wardrobes or even their public accomplishments. They talk about people. They talk about kindness given and not given. They talk about who they loved, who they hurt, who they forgave, who they failed to forgive in time. This is a remarkably consistent pattern, recorded across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems. At the end, when the costume of cells is being prepared to be put down, the things that suddenly matter are almost without exception relational and moral. The currency of regret and the currency of gratitude rise to the surface, and almost everything else recedes. Researchers studying what is sometimes called legacy have noticed that small acts of kindness have a strange durability. The way a teacher treated a single shy student in 1974 may be reverberating 2 generations later in the way that student now treats a stranger at a bus stop. A single moment of patience can, in this gentle way, propagate forward for half a century. A single moment of cruelty can, in less gentle ways, do the same. The threads are quiet, but they do not always break with the body that started them. Some have wondered whether this is a hint, written into the very physics of social life, about what kind of currency actually travels. Acts of kindness, honesty in small moments, the forgiveness extended when withholding it would have been easier, the tenderness offered to someone who could not possibly repay it. These do not, on the surface, look like wealth, but they appear to be the only kind of wealth a body cannot leave behind on the way out. If life is, in some way, a temporary visit, then it might make sense that the only valuable luggage is the kind that fits in a soul rather than a suitcase. The kindness you gave when no one demanded it, the patience you offered when irritation would have been justified, the small refusals to be cruel, these perhaps are the things that quietly accumulate in a currency that does not stay behind, the things that travel. Watch a small child, before they have been formally taught very much, encounter unfairness. Take a toy from one child, hand it to another, for no reason. The first child does not have to consult any tradition, any law, any cultural manual to react. Something inside the child already knows, with quiet certainty, that something has just gone wrong. They protest before they have the vocabulary to explain why. They cry as though they had been instructed in justice in some previous course of study. Developmental psychologists have observed this kind of pattern with growing wonder. Babies as young as a few months old show a preference for puppets that help over puppets that hinder. Toddlers without instruction often display early signs of empathy when another child cries. Small children in widely different cultures spontaneously develop similar notions of fairness, ownership, sharing, and reciprocity, long before any formal teaching has had time to install them. This is, when you think about it, strange. If morality were entirely a product of culture, you would expect a much wider variety of moral starting points. You would expect some children, in some cultures, to come into the world simply not caring at all about whether others were hurt. You would expect cultural training to have to do all of the work. But the data, gently, does not show this. Across enormous diversity, certain core moral intuitions appear nearly everywhere, as though they were already installed, and culture were merely shaping what was already there. Some have called this the moral sense. Others have called it conscience. Many spiritual traditions have called it something older and softer, a small light placed inside every soul before it entered this world, dimmed perhaps, but never fully extinguished. The names differ, the phenomenon does not. You can feel this compass even now. You do not have to consult any external authority to know that betraying a trust would weigh on you. You do not need a textbook to feel that lying to someone who depends on you would settle, like sediment, in the bottom of your evenings. The compass does not always shout. Sometimes it murmurs, sometimes it merely hesitates, but it is, almost without exception, there. Notice how interesting this is. A purely accidental creature, shaped only by the rough mechanics of survival, would not necessarily come pre-equipped with such a finely sensitive instrument. Survival rewards many things, but it does not obviously require the sort of moral subtlety that makes a person quietly uncomfortable about an unkind tone of voice they used 3 days ago. That degree of sensitivity is almost too refined for the job description of staying alive. Some have wondered whether the moral compass is one of the most personal pieces of equipment a soul is given when it enters this place. Not a constraint imposed from outside, not a leash. Something more like a navigational instrument, a device that does not tell you exactly where to go, but quietly indicates when you are walking in a direction that the deepest part of you, the part from before this life, would not approve of. When you ignore that compass, the journey grows confusing. When you honor it, even in small things, the journey grows clearer, almost as if the compass were tuned to a destination you have not yet remembered consciously, a homeland that is still pulling gently on the needle. No matter where the costume of cells happens to be standing, there is a strange thing the human heart does, and almost no one stops to notice it. You can be sitting in an airport completely unrelated, by blood or culture, to almost everyone around you and watch a stranger across the room receive bad news. Their face changes, their shoulders fall, and, without your permission, something in you bends slightly toward them. You may never speak to them, you may never know what the call was about, but for an instant you are pulled, very softly, into caring. This is almost embarrassing if you think about it too directly. From a strictly survival point of view, the suffering of an unrelated stranger should not move you. You have no genetic stake in their well-being. They will not feed you, protect you, or pass on your genes. And yet the pull is there, almost involuntarily, almost reliably, in most human beings most of the time. Neuroscientists have studied something called mirror neurons, brain cells that activate not only when you perform an action, but also when you watch someone else perform that same action. There is gentle scientific debate about exactly how far the mirror system extends, but the broader fact is well established. The human brain in many ways simulates other minds. When you see someone wince, parts of your own pain network are quietly nudged. When you watch a stranger cry, your own emotional circuitry is, in subtle ways, recruited. You are not, in any clean way, separate from other people. Your interior partly echoes theirs. This goes well beyond mirror neurons. Long-distance fundraising for disasters in countries the donor has never visited. Anonymous donations to causes that will never bring the giver any recognition. The instinct to comfort a child who is not yours when you see them crying in a supermarket aisle. The way an entire room can fall silent when one person begins to weep. These are not arrangements of self-interest. They are something else, something stubbornly present again and again across cultures. Some have wondered whether this near-universal pull of empathy beyond family is not merely a leftover of small group living, as many biologists suggest, but something quieter and stranger, a whisper that all of us, in some prior sense, are related in a way the body alone cannot register. That if the souls of all human beings came, originally, from the same place, then on some level the recognition between strangers is not a sentimental construction, it is a memory. You can sometimes feel this even more strongly with people who are radically different from you. A face in a documentary, a voice in a story, a photograph of a child on the other side of the planet, whose situation has nothing to do with your life. Something in you tightens, something in you wants to help, and may even act on it. The pull is older than the politics. It is older than the borders. Perhaps the strangers around you are not as strange as the costume of cells leads you to believe. Perhaps the boundaries between selves, while real in the body, are softer where the soul is. Perhaps every face you see, even the unfamiliar ones, is a face you would in another light recognize. A traveler wearing a different costume on the same journey, walking the same corridor, carrying beneath the surface the same long, half-remembered errand. Almost everything in your life was lent to you. Look around the room slowly, if you can. The clothes on your body, the chair beneath you, the roof above, the very atoms that compose the warm hand resting on the arm of that chair. None of them, in the deepest sense, are yours by birthright. They were given, they were arranged, they were placed in your care briefly for the length of a visit. And when the visit ends, they will be returned one way or another to the slow currents from which they came. This sounds at first like a sad observation, but sit with it for a moment. and something gentler emerges. If almost everything you have is borrowed, then almost nothing you lose is, strictly speaking, taken from you. It is being returned. The grief of letting go is real, and it deserves respect, but the framework underneath it is not as final as it sometimes feels. Returning a borrowed thing is, in some quiet way, the natural completion of having been allowed to use it. People who have spent significant time at the bedsides of the dying have noticed something that surprises those who have not. Many people, in the very last days of their lives, develop an unexpected calm. Not always, not everyone, but often. Researchers in palliative and hospice care have documented this pattern over many decades. After the initial shock and fear of facing the end, a remarkable number of dying people settle into a kind of soft acceptance. They become gentler, they forgive more easily. They appear sometimes to be already letting things slip back into the larger current. Some who work in this field have written that it is as though the dying, in their final stretch, begin to remember something the rest of us have forgotten. That whatever this life was, it was always borrowed. That the act of returning when the time comes is not a violation of the order of things, it is the completion of it. The visit ends, the visitor steps out into a hallway dimly familiar, and the room is gently tidied for whatever comes next. This is not a recommendation to hurry through anything. The body is precious, the visit is precious, the people in your life are precious. None of it is diminished by being temporary. If anything, the temporariness is what makes it luminous. A flower that bloomed for 10,000 years would not draw the same hush from us that a flower lasting only a week does. There is, in many old traditions, the idea that a soul that has spent its visit well does not arrive at the door of return with empty hands, not in the sense of bringing things along, since the body cannot smuggle objects through that doorway, but in the sense of having been shaped, of having become more honest, more patient, more grateful, more capable of love than the soul that first entered. The visit was for that. The borrowed costume was for that. The whole journey, in some quiet sense, was for that. So when something in your life ends, even tonight, even small things, you can soften slightly around it. The breath you just exhaled, the day that just passed, the moment of attention you are about to release towards sleep. None of these are losses in the deepest sense. They are returns, gentle handings back of things that were never yours to keep, only yours to wear. While the visit was unfolding in this strange and beautiful place, let us pause here gently and let the threads of all that has been said begin, on their own, to settle. There is no need to summarize it forcefully. The mind, when it is allowed to slow, is remarkably good at arranging things by itself. You only have to sit quietly while the pieces find their places. There was the body that is constantly being renewed, while something inside it remains unchanged. The hunger that never quite finds its food, the homesickness that has no return address, the nightly disappearance into sleep, the disproportionate ache of joy in the presence of beauty, the strange weight of being aware, the cosmos balanced on improbable settings, the information written into the smallest places of every cell, the mathematics that fits the world too well to be casual, the soft cage of time, the witness behind every thought, the whispers in the old books, the forgotten oath, the mercy of forgetting, the two pulls, the curriculum of suffering, the unreasonable shortness of the visit, the garden in every culture, the geometry of longing, the dreams of unvisited places, the letters left in many languages, the text preserved with unusual care, the compass that already knows, the strangers who are family, the borrowed things gently returning. None of these by themselves prove anything. That is the honest truth. Each one could be explained in other ways, and the explanations would not be unreasonable. But taken together softly as a single quiet picture rather than a stack of arguments, they begin to suggest something. They begin to imply, without forcing, that the human being is not entirely native to this place, that the visitor inside the costume came from somewhere, is here for a reason that involves becoming rather than acquiring, and will in the fullness of time return. You do not have to agree tonight. You do not have to disagree either. This is not a courtroom. There is no verdict required from you. There is only a soft recognition, available if you want it, that the small persistent feelings you have had your whole life, the feelings that the world is real and that you are also more than the world, may not have been confused, they may have been quietly accurate. Notice how this changes the texture of being awake at night. The restlessness that often visits in the dark begins to look less like anxiety and more like a low signal, a reminder that whatever you came here for, you are still here, still in the test, still able to choose how you will spend the next moment of attention. Whatever has been carried, whatever has been lost, whatever has been mishandled, the visit is not over yet. There is still time for the visitor to remember a little more. The recognition does not have to be loud. It can be the quietest thing in your night. There is a relief that comes when you no longer need to know everything. For most of life, we drive ourselves a little mad trying to settle every question, decide every position, fix every uncertainty into a tidy answer. And yet some of the most important questions about being alive simply will not behave that way. They refuse to be finished. Researchers studying contemplative states have noticed that people who can rest gently in not knowing tend to show lower long-term stress, greater emotional flexibility, and a kind of soft clarity that is hard to manufacture by other means. There is something in the human nervous system that calms when permission is granted to leave a question open rather than forcing it shut. The body in some way recognizes honesty. You can practice this even now. You can let the largest questions of your life sit, unfinished, on a quiet shelf inside you. The questions about why you are here, what comes after, what the visit really means. You do not need to answer them tonight. You probably could not, even if you tried. The veil over deep origins is dense for everyone, and the demand to be certain is a heavier burden than the mind was designed to carry. Imagine your questions as small lamps left burning, low and soft, in a corridor you do not have to walk all the way through tonight. You can see by their light. You do not need to see beyond it. The fact that the lamps are there at all, glowing in the dimness, is itself a kindness. They mean someone, at some point, expected you to need them. There is a particular humility in this kind of rest. It is not the humility of giving up. It is the humility of recognizing that you are a small consciousness, briefly walking through a very large and very old place, and that some of the answers belong to a chapter that has not yet been opened for you. Trying to force them open before their time only tears the page. Many of the wisest figures in human history, across many traditions, have ended their lives by saying, in different languages, the same thing. There is so much I still do not know. They were not failures. They had simply learned, after long and serious effort, the right size for the human mind, smaller than the universe, large enough to wonder about it, quiet enough to live within the wondering. You are allowed tonight to be one of those quiet wanderers. You do not have to solve the test in order to keep walking through it. You only have to keep walking, gently, with whatever light has been given to you so far. Notice, before sleep begins to fully take you, a small and peaceful thought. If everything that has been gently considered tonight is true, even in part, then guidance has not been withheld from you. It has been offered, again and again across centuries, in many forms, in many voices. The hardest part is not finding it. The hardest part is being still enough to hear it. Across the corridors of human history, messages have arrived. Sometimes in books, sometimes in songs, sometimes in the quiet words of a grandparent who, without realizing it, repeated something a much older tradition had repeated for thousands of years. Sometimes in the small internal voice of conscience, which is, in its own way, a private letter, addressed only to the one reading it. You do not have to engage with any of this tonight. You do not have to study any text, attend anything, decide anything, or change anything. The simple, soft recognition is enough for now that you are not without resources, that the journey, while difficult, is not unguided, that the letters have already been sent, and they will still be there in the morning, waiting on the table when, or if, you choose to look at them. There is among them that one envelope mentioned earlier, the recitation preserved with unusual care across more than 14 centuries. It is, in a sense, still being delivered every day, by ordinary people memorizing it in their own homes all over the world. If a curious traveler, suspecting they have been placed in this place for a reason, ever wanted a careful, unhurried look at a message that has been handled with extraordinary attention by an extraordinary number of hands across a great deal of time, they would not have to look very hard. The envelope is patient. It does not chase. It waits. For tonight, however, no decision is being asked of you. Only a quiet softening into the awareness that, whatever this life is, you are not the first one to walk through it, not the first one to wonder, and not the first one to be quietly addressed. Many before you have read what was left for them, and many will after you. If at some point in the days to come the curiosity returns, you can follow it slowly. There is no rush. The deepest things in this universe do not punish patience, they reward it, and whatever was meant for you, in the way of guidance, will still be there when you are ready to listen. For now, the only task is rest. Let the body grow heavier. Let the room around you soften. Notice the small weight of your own breath, moving in, moving out, without your permission, the way it has done since the day you arrived in this place, the way it will continue to do, quietly, all the way until the visit ends. The lamps in the corridor are still lit. The questions are still resting on their shelf. The letters are still on the table. None of them are going anywhere. The mind can step away from them tonight without losing them. If the visitor inside the costume of cells is, even possibly from somewhere else, then sleep is not as strange as it has always seemed. It is, in some gentle sense, a small rehearsal, a short nightly version of the longer return. The body lies down. The day's noise releases its grip. Attention loosens. The self that was so certain of itself a moment ago becomes blurred, then absent, then present in a different way, in a different room, in a softer light. You do not need to be afraid of this nightly disappearance. You have done it thousands of times already. Every night you slept, something in you stepped briefly out of the room of waking, and every morning, gently, something stepped back in. The path is well worn, the doorway is familiar. Tonight you can practice it as a kindness, letting go just slightly of the urgency of being someone, letting the day's small failures and small triumphs drift out, like air leaving a lung at the end of a long breath. The visit is not over. There is more to come tomorrow and the day after. But for these quiet hours ahead, the visitor is allowed to rest. There is, in the deepest part of you, the part beneath thought, beneath worry, beneath every name you have ever been called, a small awareness that recognizes this softening, that has always recognized it, that has never been afraid of sleep, because it knows in some way that does not need to be explained, that sleep is only a smaller version of something it has done before. Stepping out of a room, trusting the corridor, knowing the larger house is still standing. So let the body rest now. Let the eyes grow heavy. Let the breath grow long and slow. The whole journey has been gently waiting, all this time, for the visitor to remember that it is allowed to rest. The test is not lost by closing your eyes tonight. The corridor will be here in the morning. The lamps will still be lit. For now, you are simply, softly, drifting toward home.